Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Prayers of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. And you can support the channel on Subscribestar Locals and Buy Me a Coffee, as well as Substack. So today's episode, The Tale of Two Military Revolutions Part 2, is the continuation and final part of an earlier lecture I gave a couple months ago on the medieval revolution. The first one was cavalry, beginning at Adrianople. And then as I wrote that, I realized, well, to cover the infantry revolution would be a lot more detailed. So I decided to break it up into two. The fact that it took a little while was because other ideas were coming to me. And you know how it is with the muses. You got some coming to you, and then you got to wait for the other one. So now we're here, part 2 of the Tale of Two Military Revolutions. Without much further ado, here we begin. The Infantry Revolution from 1346 to 1534. In my first episode on medieval military revolutions, I discussed the rise of cavalry forces as the arm of decision, with the stirrup being crucial, as it allowed for a rider to use a couched lance and transmit all of the force of his charge into an enemy. This mounted lancer was the dominant soldier around Eurasia, supported by horse archers in Roman, Saracen, Turkic, and Mongolian armies. Western Europeans never embraced the horse archer. The heyday of the mounted knight was 1066 to 1346, or from Hastings to Crecy. The earlier forms, such as the Roman and Persian Clibanarii, with later Saracen Ghulam cavalry, cemented the rise of mounted lancers in the Near East. Mounted lancers married protection, mobility, and shock power into one devastating package. Infantry formations in classical antiquity could sustain a cavalry charge, such as Greek hoplites, Macedonian phalanx, and Roman legions. But these were well-armed and trained soldiers who not only used their weapons, but terrain to their advantage. Today, I will discuss the rise of infantry as the bedrock of Western military formations, as in the days of Greece and Rome. We can divide this period into two major segments, 1346 to 1494, with the perfection of traditional infantry fighting styles, with the bow, the pike, and the wagon, and 1494 to 1534, with the use of new technologies revolving around gunpowder and new military tactics. This first period is dominated by the English, the Swiss, and the Bohemians. The latter periods by the Spanish and the Ottoman Turks, with the understanding that the Ottoman Turks were dominant in both periods, successfully transitioning from traditional methods to new methods of war. Therefore, in today's episode, we will focus on 5 military powers: the English, the Swiss, the Bohemians, the Turks, and the Spanish. The first period, from 1346 to 1494, marks the end of medieval warfare and the rise of modern warfare in the Renaissance. 1494 marks the beginning of the Italian Wars between Valois France and Trastamara and later Habsburg Spain for control of the rich Italian countryside, and provided the experimental data in the form of battles and sieges for the Spanish to develop new tactics in war. The Hundred Years' War, the Swiss wars against Austria and Burgundy, and the Hussite wars were medieval wars, and that the new technologies revolving around gunpowder were only just coming to the fore, and were not yet fully decisive as they would be later. In the East, the Ottomans successfully shift from medieval-style warfare to modern Renaissance gunpowder warfare. To summarize, medieval warfare was decentralized in nature. The core of the military force was the semi-professional class of mounted warriors known as knights. The knight might have his own corps of loyal knights, but his vassals would be expected in war to produce their own contingents. This force might be supplemented by mercenaries or hastily raised peasant levies. These forces lacked staying power, and central control was difficult at best. Renaissance warfare was different. With the Spanish, French, and Turks, we see a centralized state with a professional standing army supported by the state, supplied with arquebuses, cannons, and supplies. Control was top-down and tight. Campaigns could be protracted and sustained. This transition was hard for medieval states to make. Switzerland and Bohemia failed to make this transition, and England, due to internal discord after the 100 Years' War, was late in making these changes. 3 states stand out. France, Spain, and the Ottomans were able to make this change successfully first. In the first period, we can subdivide the years 1346 to 1494 into 3 broad periods: the English, the Swiss, and the Hussite. The English period lasts from 1346 to 1453 with their campaigns in the 100 Years' War. While the War of the Roses is the continuation of such practices as developed by the English on the continent, little new innovation took place. The brutality of the war and the total extinction of the House Plantagenet can in part be accounted for by the lethality of English tactics honed in the wars in France and turned inward in civil strife. This period marks the rise of the English longbowmen with reliable logistics for sustained military operations in France and the rise of a semi-professional army. The Swiss period properly begins before 1346 at Morgarten, 1315, but continues through up until 1515 at the Battle of Margiana, where French massed artillery smashed the Swiss pike formations. This period can be further subdivided into before and after the introduction of the pike, which took place after the Battle of Arbedo in 1422, in which dismounted Milanese men-at-arms with lances defeated Swiss halberdiers. The Hussite period is the shortest, most mercurial of all, ranging from 1419 to 1434. The wagon, as used in a defensive posture of defense, is an ancient German military tactic found in accounts of the battles of Aquae Sextiae, 102 BC, and Adrianople, 376 AD. The Hussite variant was the result of Zizka's military experience with the Poles as a mercenary. This was developed from the Russian Goliogorod, or mobile fortress. Irresistible in the defense against mounted or foot troops, only artillery strikes or surprise attacks that prevented the wagon from being set up worked. The Turks stretched both periods from 1349 to 1494, developing a corps of professionals, the Janissaries, who were trained bowmen who fought in the English fashion, though with recurved rather than simple bows. The Turks quickly adopted firearms for their Janissaries, with arquebuses being used as early as the 1440s, likely as a result of the introduction to the hand cannons by the Hungarians, who in turn got it from the Bohemians. This period can be seen as a perfection of ancient modes of war, archery, pikemen, and wagons. The second period, from 1494 to 1534, is the Spanish era, and charts the rise of a professional army in a teething period from where Spain experiments with arquebuses, short sword-wielding rodoleros, and field fortifications were tested in Italy. At the end of this period, we have the beginning of pike and shot with the tertio, a military formation that combined pikemen for the defense who formed the core of the square with a belt of arquebusmen around them, and 4 formations of the same at each corner of the square. This allowed for both firepower and shock and represented the first time since ancient Rome a Western formation was established as a permanent military unit, a latter-day cohort. This period can be seen as the perfection of a new way of war rooted around developing technologies. English archery revolution. As discussed in the previous lecture, the rise of the Welsh-style longbow developed after Edward I conquered Wales in his reign and was first utilized against the Scots, with the latter's crushing defeat at Falkirk. The longbowman took a lifetime to train, not too dissimilar to a medieval knight. In England, the king outlawed all sports on Sunday except archery. It was expected that from ancient tradition, able-bodied men in England were to practice archery regardless of wealth. The 1252 Assizes of Arms and Edward III's 1363 Declaration are primary sources on this matter. A bowman might be procured for a military expedition either by commission, indenture, or as retainers. A commission was a declaration from the king to a lord to ready a certain predetermined number of men from his state to be ready for war. Many such men were bowmen. An indenture was a contract in which nobles would promise to provide a predetermined number of soldiers for a preset time for an agreed-upon price. Lastly, retainers were the personal guard of a nobleman and his direct pay in professional soldiers. This meant that as a rule, longbowmen were semi-professional, a sort of militia system from which a large pool of able-bodied men trained for archery and from which new units of men could be formed existed in England at this time. The defining feature of the English bowman was his longbow. The longbow was a simple bow, usually made from yew. The average bow was 6 feet long with a draw strength of anywhere from 80 to 180 pounds. 2 forms of arrows were used, broad-headed and bodkin. A broad-headed arrow was leaf-shaped with the head and used against unarmored troops. The bodkin arrow had a small, hardened tip for use in piercing enemy armor. For close combat, a knife and a buckler were issued, and they were protected by a visorless helmet and cloth gambeson armor. Longbowmen would also carry sharpened stakes and a mallet to pound them into the ground as part of a defensive barrier to enemy knights. English armies would also have knights who fought mounted and dismounted, as well as auxiliary light troops such as the Welsh and Irish, as well as English yeomen armed with a polearm of the bill. The usual tactical formation would have the archers in the center with sharpened stakes placed in front of them for protection, and the right and left wings being dismounted men-at-arms or billmen angled outward, forming from a bird's eye view a sort of open cup shape. This formation would usually be set up between rivers, hills, or woods in order to prevent the French from outflanking them, and by baiting the enemy into an attack along the central avenue, bringing them into a kill zone to destroy them. Tactical example: Nájera 1367. While the battles of Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt are famous for the use of longbowmen and their crushing defeats of French heavy cavalry, the Black Prince's intervention into the Castilian Civil War indicates the versatility of the longbow and its ability to secure victory against any foe. The Castilian Civil War was an extension of the Hundred Years' War. Pedro of Castile was supported by England, and Enrique by France and Aragon. Enrique led an army of 29,500 men, and the Anglo-Castilian force of Pedro and the Black Prince numbered 24,000 men. Each army was deployed with 3 battle formations, one in front of the other. For Enrique's force, the front line was led by Du Guesclin with 1,500 men-at-arms and 500 crossbowmen. The second line was composed of a mix of French and Castilian infantry, along with flanking formations of light cavalry, the famous Spanish jinties, supported by knights. The third and rear line was composed of professional and conscript infantry. John of Gaunt led the forwardmost English formation with 3,000 infantry and an equal number of archers. The central force was led by the Black Prince and Pedro with 4,000 men, half of whom were archers, and the other half footmen, along with 2 flanking battalions led by Debouche on the right and Percy on the left, with a similar force distribution to John's center. The rear line, as by the King of Majorca and the Duke of Armagnac, with 3,000 foot and 3,000 archers. The Black Prince, prior to the battle, ordered his mounted men to dismount with their horses sent to the rear. Enrique's forces were deployed with their backs to the river Najarilla, defending a bridge that would lead to Najara. Enrique planned a frontal assault on John of Gaunt's formation. His screen of crossbowmen was scattered by the English archers, but the weight of men-at-arms forced the English bowmen to retreat. The lines of de Guesclin and John of Gaunt engaged in fearsome hand-to-hand combat. The flanking attack led by the second line of battle in Enrique's army, in which the light jinties would harass and wear down enemy formations to disorder enemy forces before the heavy cavalry rode into the line to destroy them, was decisively checked by the force of Debouche and Percy with relentless archery volleys. A final charge by the Spanish heavy cavalry was scattered, and the remaining Spanish horse fled the field. The forces of Debouche and Percy then wheeled inwards and hit the flanks of de Guesclin, with the archers placed in a defensive posture to resist any counterattack by Enrique. Enrique counterattacked first with his knights, who charged 3 times, and then sent his men on foot. Each time, all the attacks were repulsed by English archers. After this repulse, Enrique retreated. Left alone, the forces of de Guesclin surrendered. This battle illustrates that longbowmen, when properly supported, can be decisive in the assault as well as in the defense, and were able to adapt to the novel cavalry tactics of the Spanish. Swiss infantry revolution. In defense of their own cantons, the Swiss depended on a militia system to procure the manpower necessary for battle. Initially, the Swiss were primarily equipped with the shorter polearm, the halberd, and skirmish units equipped with bows, crossbows, and early firearms. After their defeat by dismounted Milanese men-at-arms using lances at Arbedo in 1422, they shifted to the use of pike formations. The main strike came from the polearm-wielding footmen, with skirmishers screening or supporting the main attack. Speed was paramount, and heavy armor was discarded in favor of a helmet and breastplate. The Swiss formations advanced in echelon with 3 corps, the first or Vorhut, the second or Gewaltschaffen, and the third or Nachschut. The 3 corps were deployed in echelon, with the second corps placed parallel to the right or left and rear of the first corps, with a similar positioning of the third corps behind the second. This positioning system allowed for the corps behind to cover the flanks of the corps in front, as any flanking maneuver would risk being hit by the following corps. Tactical example: Murat or Merton, 1476. Charles the Bold, King of Burgundy, had besieged the city of Murat, 30 kilometers from Bern. The Burgundian army on paper was modernized, and a mixed force with a combined arms approach, utilizing gunpowder artillery, English-style archers, and hand cannons, with pikemen and men-at-arms, along with mounted knights being included in the force. Yet poor leadership by Charles was fatal. As he laid siege to Murat, he established a fortified position of entrenchments which covered the southeast approach to the city. Charles had intended to hold this fortified line with a mix of footmen and gunners, with his right flank covered by cavalry and his left by an artillery battery. The total number of forces was 10,248 men. The Swiss force was 25,000 men strong with allied cavalry from Lorraine. Outnumbered 2-1 and with poor generalship, the Burgundians were badly handled by the Swiss. The defensive line was held by 2,000 archers and handgunners, supported by 1,200 horse. The first Swiss column was the skirmish line of 5,000 men, half missile troop and half pike, with supporting cavalry. The second column was composed of 12,000 halberdiers, and the third column was 7,000 more halberdiers. Much of Charles's army was in Camp Eating. A forest screened the Swiss forces so that only 20 minutes was allowed from the first sighting of the forwardmost Swiss column to a direct clash over the trenches. This lightly held line of defense was quickly taken, and the disordered Burgundian main army was scattered. Desultory cavalry charges were repulsed, and the Italian and Savoyard forces blocking Murat were scattered. Through a combination of failing to station light infantry as pickets to watch for the approaching Swiss, to building insufficient entrenchments, compounded by inadequate allocation of forces to defend said entrenchments, and the main body of troops being inactive due to lunch at the time of the attack, a series of fatal errors led to a crushing defeat at the hands of the Swiss formation. Bohemian Wagon Revolution. Born out of the Catholic suppression of the Reformation movement, led by Jan Hus, who was treacherously burned at the stake under the promise of protection, and suppression of Hussite religionists in Bohemia, a military uprising developed in 1419, kicking off the Hussite Wars. The Hussite cause was led by the lower Bohemian nobility and local clergy who formed the leadership of the movement, and the people were galvanized by popular religious fervor. That Zizka could take unskilled peasants with nothing but their farm tools and zeal and turn them into a crack fighting force that could defeat the flower of European chivalry is a testament to his military genius. The tactical formation of the Hussites was the Wagenlager or fort. When deployed, the wagons would have iron chains and hooks that connected them. These wagons would be placed in a circular formation where missile troops and early mobile field guns would be placed. There would be both an outward-facing circle of wagons and an inward-facing circle of wagons, a circle within a circle. The outward-facing wagons had iron fronts and protective hoardings to shield from missile fire. The inner circle were the baggage wagons. Each wagon had a crew of 10, usually handgunners and flailmen, but could include pikemen and crossbowmen. Culverins were placed between the two wagon circles. This formation was for all practical purposes impenetrable by mounted men. Furthermore, a small strike force of foot and horse were kept inside to either harass the enemy or exploit a gap in the enemy lines. On the march, Hussite wagons formed 5 columns, one behind the other, with the middle column being artillery and horse, with the front 2 and back 2 being the wagon fort proper. Coupled with religious zeal and strict discipline that did not distinguish between nobleman or commoner, these men were highly motivated and professional. The use of both field guns and handguns was extremely innovative for the time. The tactical formation of the Hussites could only really be fought either by using light forces to attack the wagons before they set up, use of artillery fire to batter them, or as was the case in the Battle of Lipany in 1434, use a feigned retreat to coax the men from their superior position. Couple this with the decline in religious zeal and civil war between the moderate Hussite Utraquists and the radical Taborites, the 2 pillars of the Hussite formation were broken: tight military formation and high morale due to religious unity. Tactical example, Battle of Horus, 1423. The typical tactical deployment of Zizka was to secure the nearest high ground and, if possible, form his battle line around a local church. As the church tower would give him sight of the approaching enemy, he would then form his Wagenlager and await an enemy attack. He would use artillery fire accompanied by volleys from his infantry to disorder the enemy formations. When he perceived the enemy was sufficiently disordered, he would raise his battle standard and open the gates of his wagons and attack the enemy. At Horus, he secured the heights of the Gothard Plateau and the Church of St. Gothard as the middle of the battle line. This elevated terrain forced his enemy to dismount his knights, who marched on foot and were exhausted marching uphill in heavy armor. Throughout this battle, as the enemy forces approached his wagons, he would send forth infantry formations to engage and harass them, driving them from the field. Ottoman Janissaries. The Janissary Corps represents the first modern standing military unit in Western history. Founded by Murad I, the Corps represented a professional and loyal force that formed the core of the Ottoman armies. Janissary was recruited through the Deveshirm system, whereby Christian boys from subject peoples from the ages of 7 to 20 would be taken and converted to Islam. Some boys would be called advisors, called viziers, though boys with a more martial potential would become janissaries. Janissaries were forbidden to marry before the age of 40, as well as engage in trade. This ensured the loyalty to the Sultan. The rigid and stoic life of a soldier was compensated for by the promotion to the highest ranks of society by the age of 40 if he served well. The equipment of the janissary included a recurved composite bow to ensure mobility. The armor of the janissary was a light, only a felt cap and tunic. For close-in defense, he was also equipped with a scimitar and a short knife. Like the English archers, he was also equipped with sharpened stakes to be placed in front of his archers in order to blunt a cavalry charge. Practical example, Nicopolis, 1396. 16,000 crusaders under the combined leadership of Sigismund, King of Hungary, Jean Vienne, Admiral of France, and Philip, Count of Vautois, squared off against 20,000 Turks under Sultan Bayezid in an effort to lift the siege of Nicopolis. The Crusader army was composed of Hungarians, French, Burgundians, and Wallachian contingents. The Turkish army was composed of Turkish regular and irregular horse, Safahi and Azaps, respectively, and regular and irregular foot, Janissaries and Yayas, respectively, and a contingent of Serbian vassal knights. With his back to the Danube, King Sigismund set up camp. The Hungarian contingents were deployed in the rear, close to the river, and the French and Burgundian contingents nearer to the Turks. Bayezid developed a screen of irregular horse in front of his army to conceal his deployments. He set up a row of sharpened stakes chest high to the horses of the French knights and deployed his irregular Yaya infantry archers, stiffened with his elite Janissary Corps behind the stakes. On his right flank were deployed the Romilian regular horse, and on his left the elite Safahi and the Serbian vassal knights, with a reserve of Serbian men-at-arms. King Sigismund, upon hearing of the arrival of the Turkish vanguard, wished to wait for his scouts to return for a more accurate account of the enemy formation. His French contingents, led by Jean Vienne and Philip of Artois, counseled immediate action and accused Sigismund and the older knights of cowardice. Against the council of cooler heads, the French knights charged forward. The irregular horse of Bayezid fired a couple of volleys and then peeled away to the right and left, revealing the line of archers protected by sharpened stakes. What happened next was a repeat of the French defeats at Crécy and Poitiers, where entrenched archers rained death on the French knights. Some unhorsed French knights engaged in a melee with the Turkish archers and pushed them back. These Turkish foot reformed around the Safahi. As the French regrouped upon their flank, the elite Ottoman Safahi appeared, crashing into their flank, scattering them and cutting them down. A juncture of the Hungarian forces with the French was prevented by the deployment of Serbian mounted knights. This crushing defeat of the Crusaders shows how a combined arms approach by the Ottomans countered French impetuosity. While the Turkish archer line did not hold, as did the English lines in Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, this is likely due to the fact that most of the archers were irregular Yaya rather than Janissaries. The Janissary Corps at this time was quite small and likely used to stiffen up the irregulars. Nonetheless, such damage was done to the French knights that they were defenseless, being unhorsed against Bayezid's counterstroke. The Spanish origins of a modern professional army. The Spanish army of the Italian wars was an elite force honed by centuries of warfare against the Moors, the Moorish and Berber forces of Islam in Iberia. The Reconquista was the centuries-long forging of a national identity. In combating the forces of Islam, the Spanish had formed a mixed army of heavy and light cavalry, supported by heavy and light foot. The Union of Castile and Aragon in 1479 gave Spanish-Italian territories in Sicily and Naples. These claims would draw Spain into a conflict with France in the Italian Wars, which began with Charles VIII's claim to Naples via his Angevin heritage. From 1494 to 1534, in this 40-year period, the Spanish developed from a style that was used to fighting the fast-moving and often irregular Islamic forces to an infantry force based to confront the French armies, who depended on the heavyweight hitters of the Swiss pikemen and elite gendarme heavy cavalry to the combined arms tertio, a precursor to modern standardized military units. The Spanish military, while utilizing knights and dismounted men-at-arms, had a higher proportion of light troops and skirmishers than other European armies at the time. This was due to the preference for Moorish forces using light cavalry armed with javelins and light foot with javelin and shield. This led to a highly mobile hit-and-run force that was hard to pin down. The French were the opposite. Hardened by the Hundred Years' War, they relied on heavy cavalry, artillery, and Swiss pikemen to shatter enemy formations, which is what happened at Seminara in 1495. The Spanish forces in this battle were composed of the new sword and buckler men, or rotileros, and a large contingent of Spanish jinty cavalry, or light skirmisher, horse archers, or horses armed with javelins. These forces were pressed by the Swiss pikemen and French heavy cavalry, scattering them. Cordoba would begin a series of reforms that would radically alter the Spanish military. Learning from this defeat in the First Italian War, Cordoba reformed his army. He introduced the columnelas, a formation of mixed rotileros, pikemen, and missile troops, initially crossbowmen and later arquebusiers. Cordoba introduced professional military training and increased reliance on firearms and field artillery, the use of field fortifications and entrenchments, and integrated infantry and cavalry formations. At Cerengola, 1503, in the Third Italian War, Cordoba, using entrenchments, firearms, and pikes, repulsed French heavy cavalry. At the time of the Battle of Bicocca, 1522, the Spanish forces had integrated all of the reforms of Cordoba, integrated with German Landsknecht pikemen into their formations. The might of the Swiss pikemen were shattered with a combination of field artillery, firearms, entrenchments, and German Landsknechts. Tactical example, Pavia, 1525. In this battle between Francis I of France and Charles V of Spain, we see all the Spanish military reforms in place for a crushing Habsburg victory. The battle was massive for the time, with over 50,000 men total engaged. The French forces numbered 24,200 men, composed of 4,000 foot soldiers, 1,200 gendarmes, knights, 2,200 men-at-arms, 8,000 Swiss pikemen, 4,000 black band landsknechts, 2,000 Italian mercenaries, 1,000 Spaniards, 2,000 French light horse, and artillery. Spanish forces numbered a total of 28,300 men, with 12,000 landsknechts, 5,000 Spaniards, 3,000 Italians, the garrison of Pavia between 6,500 and 10,000 men, and 1,500 knights and some artillery. The French king Francis had laid siege to Pavia by encircling the city. He had fortified Visconti Park, where he and the main body of his men were located. Spanish pioneers breached the walls surrounding Visconti Park, and the Spanish army straddled the French army's line of communication. Once the breach was made at 5 a.m., a detachment of arquebusiers, numbering 3,000, moved toward Mirabello Castle and were supported by Imperial light horse. French horses were sent into the breach and engaged with the Spanish arquebusiers and engaged with the recently arrived 6,000 landsknechts by 7 a.m. at some distance from the original breach. The French king counterattacked with his gendarmes and black band landsknechts. The French charge defeated the Spanish light horse, with the two opposing landsknechts formations engaging hand-to-hand combat. The Spanish then sent in pikemen and the arquebusiers, converging on the French knights, slaying many and capturing Francis I. We see that the Spanish have come a long way since Seminara. They could engage the French on equal terms and coordinate complex maneuvers to their own advantage. By straddling Francis's line of communications, the Spanish were able to force him to attack, which allowed them to engage on their terms from the stronger position of defense. All of these lessons were summed up in the era of pike and shot, where the Spanish introduced the tercio. The tercio is Spanish for 3 and was composed usually of 3,000 men. It represented the return of a professional fighting force last seen since the Roman legion. Modern organizations of regiments and battalions owe their existence to the tercio. A tercio had 10 companies of 300 men, 8 of which were pike companies, with the remaining 2 being arquebusier companies. The main force was a central block of pikemen with 4 smaller squares of arquebusiers at each corner of the pike square, called bastions or sleeves. These arquebusiers would engage in skirmish fire before the shock of battle. Afterwards, they would retreat into the hollow square of the pikemen for protection or behind them. This flexible arrangement of arquebuses and pikes formed the basis of warfare for well over a century. This completes the infantry revolution and the new era of the Renaissance with pike and shot. To summarize, the infantry revolution began in 4 distinct regions in the 14th and 15th century, with the perfection of ancient modes of war, the bow with the English and Turkish forces, the pike with the Swiss, and the Bohemians with the wagon. The Turks and Bohemians were military professionals, the English semi-professional, and the Swiss talented amateurs. With the introduction of gunpowder, we see the Bohemians first realizing the importance of the weapon with the use of hand cannons and culverins. Through the intermediary of the Hungarians, the Turks embraced firearms. Spain, fresh from the Reconquista, plunges into the Italian wars and rapidly takes a scientific approach to war. Heretofore, they had been rather amateurish, as were most medieval armies. They quickly embraced the pike from the Swiss and the handguns and field artillery, and when married with breastworks were a force to be reckoned with. This process of experimentation and perfection of scientific modes of war culminated in the Spanish Tercio, ending the period of the infantry revolution. Cavalry continued to remain important, but it was no longer the arm of decision. Infantry and the rising arm of artillery would take up that role. Well, hello, Record Deepness. So that is today's episode. Hopefully that was informative to all of you. This is Todd Lewis, the Brave the Fly podcast, signing off.